What is the fine-tuning argument all about, and why is it likely the most powerful argument for God's existence? Well, imagine you're playing a game of dice with your buddies, but the guy next to you keeps throwing nothing but sixes, whereas everyone else consistently gets ones only. Surely it wouldn't take long for the gang to realize that this is not a matter of the odds just so happening to be in favor of Mr. Six, but that something else must be going on. Or imagine you're gathering for poker night and one guy gets a royal flush. Not just once, but every single round. No one would think that the guy is just incredibly lucky. Instead, the only reasonable conclusion would be that the game is rigged. Well, something very similar is going on with our universe. Its fundamental forces are very delicately balanced or fine-tuned to make life possible. The odds of them turning out just right by chance are incredibly small, which is why it is far more plausible to suggest that the universe's fine-tuning is due to design, rather than just a lucky punch. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Here are 3 examples of fine-tuning. First, take the constants of the electromagnetic and gravitational forces. The ratio between them is so delicately balanced that if it were increased or decreased by only 1 part in 10 to the power of 40, neither stars nor elements would have emerged, both of which are needed for organic life to exist. 1 part in 10 to the power of 40 is a really small number. Just for comparison, the odds of you being hit by lightning are around 1 in a million, and the odds of being hit by lightning twice are around 1 in a trillion. Now, to illustrate the probability of the fine-tuned ratio that we're talking about turning out just right by chance, imagine covering all of America with coins and columns reaching the moon. Do the same thing for 1 billion continents of America's size. Paint 1 coin red, stick it somewhere in those piles, and ask a blindfolded friend to pick it out. The odds that he will is 1 part in 10 to the power of 40. I know, that's sick, right? Second, if the cosmological constant, which controls the expansion speed of the universe, were bigger by 1 part in 10 to the power of 120, the universe would fly apart. If it were smaller by the same fraction, the universe would collapse. The billion Americas covered in coins to the moon comparison doesn't even come close to capturing the odds we're talking about here. What might put this number into perspective, though, is the fact that in our entire known universe, there are approximately 10 to the power of 80 atoms. Third, the nuclear ground state energy levels of each and every element in the periodic table have to be set in exactly the right relation to one another, something that's called resonance. If this balance were either greater or smaller by just 1%, organic life wouldn't exist. Sure, when compared to the previous 2 examples of fine-tuning, we're now operating in probability territory that's somewhat easier to wrap your head around. Still, that randomness would get you what you need when the odds are 1 in 100 is far from guaranteed. That's why the man who made the discovery about the fine-tuning of resonance, Fred Hoyle, an atheist mathematician, said that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics. Examples of fine-tuning like these abound. In fact, there are over 140 fundamental parameters of physics that are set just perfectly. The combined odds of all these forces of nature working out precisely the way they need to in order for life to exist are so small that the odds of your friend pulling a royal flush every round are peanuts in comparison. Given that it would be perfectly reasonable to conclude that luck isn't the reason for his wondrous hand, but that the game is rigged, it is exponentially more reasonable to conclude that we weren't just cosmologically lucky, but that the universe too is rigged, or in other words, designed. And the best candidate for a universe rigger or designer is God. But wait, some atheists object. If the universe weren't finely tuned for life, we wouldn't be here to observe it. And yet, we are here to observe it. And how cool is that? So actually no further explanation is needed. Let's move on to something else. This line of reasoning is called the anthropic principle, and it gets thrown around by atheists fairly frequently with the claim that this fully accounts for the fine-tuning of the universe. Now, if you think there's something fishy about the anthropic principle, you're absolutely right. Sure, it is true that we wouldn't be here if the universe weren't fine-tuned. But that's simply a rephrasing of the very issue of fine-tuning we see ourselves faced with. It's a tautology, not an explanation. I mean, imagine you're facing a firing squad of 50 people pointing their rifles at you. They fire. Yet after that, you find that you're still alive. If you applied the anthropic principle here, you'd be saying there's no explanation needed for why all of those 50 professionals missed, because if one of them didn't miss, I wouldn't be here to observe it. Seriously, that's beyond absurd. Yes, you are alive, and if you weren't, you couldn't inquire as to why you're still alive. Who would have thought that? But the very fact that you're alive, even after 50 professionals fired at you, does cry out for an explanation. And the mere fact that you're here is definitely not it. The same with our fine-tuned universe. To simply brush it aside by saying that if it weren't fine-tuned, we wouldn't be here to observe it, isn't exactly an awe-inspiring move to the inquisitive mind. Another escape route taken by skeptics who fear the conclusion of a universe-rigging God is the multiverse hypothesis. Here's the deal. The probability of your body dishing out one royal flush after the other by chance at last Saturday's poker night is practically zero. However, if you played poker every single day of your life, it might just be that in one of those games, your friend really does get a royal flush every round. Sure, it's still extremely unlikely, but just roll with the principle here. What this is about is the following. By increasing the sample size, that is, the number of games from one game to many games, you're also increasing the probability of your body ending up with a streak of royal flushes in a game. And the more you increase the sample size, the greater that probability. In fact, if you and your poker friends have eternal life and you get to play an infinite number of times, that is, if you're such nerds, then the event of your friend dishing out a series of royal flushes in a game will come to pass at some point, inevitably. And so it is with the fine-tuned universe. Skeptics acknowledge that the probability of our universe turning out life-permitting by chance is practically zero. But hey, they muse, what if ours is not the only universe? What if there are many more? In fact, what if there is an infinite number of universes? And so the skeptic who's drunk on naturalism happily inflates the sample size of universes by claiming that there is a multiverse, that is, an endless amount of universes. And with an infinite number of universes, one of those is bound to turn out life permitting. Presto! Because what's close to impossible with a sample size of 1 suddenly becomes probable, inevitable even, with an infinite sample size. Now, there is just one problem. The only universe we know of is, yes, you got it, ours. Of course, you are free to imagine there being other universes or to dream of an infinite number of them, just as you are free to dream of pink unicorns or flying elephants. But let's be clear that with that, you're leaving the realm of science. And that's because the only universe we get to access empirically and scientifically is ours. So while it all sounds fancy and scientific-y, the multiverse hypothesis is nothing but an article of faith disguised as science. Which is why Polkinghorne says of multiverse theories, let us recognize these speculations for what they are. They are not physics, but in the strictest sense, metaphysics. Swinburne adds to that, to postulate a trillion other universes rather than one God in order to explain the orderliness of our universe seems the height of irrationality. Exactly. Our fine-tuned universe is the real deal, and even atheists have come to realize that. No way is random chance a plausible explanation. Dishing out the anthropic principle is absurd, and conjuring up a trillion other universes to solve the probability problem is insane. The best explanation for our fine-tuned universe is God. If you enjoyed this video, you'll have fun watching this one, where I answer the question of whether Jesus' temptations were fake, given that being God, he knew that he couldn't sin. Check it out. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.